right, hi. Let's talk about Bryozoa, and our little mascot for today is a little bryozoan. So, when you see bryozoan fossils, these are going to be all over the place. They'll look a little bit like plants or, I don't know, like little stems, but with no leaves. But then if you look closer, you'll notice there are little tiny holes all along those. And each little hole used to be the home of an animal, and the animal looked like this guy up here. They have a lophophore, which is going to be similar to brachiopods. So these are relatives of brachiopods, but they are colonial, which is kind of interesting, whereas brachiopods are all solitary, at least as far as we know. So think of them as a teeny tiny colonial brachiopod like animal. So this is a fantastic video. It goes through a lot of the parts of their replication cycle. I'll throw a little commentary on top of it because it's only 3.5 minutes. All right, so you're going to look at these, and each individual is called a zooid. Z-O-O-I-D. There we go. Inside some of the zooids, there are specialized structures. So some of these are going to give birth to little babies. These are ovicells, and these are going to be little eggs that come out. They get fertilized externally, and the fertilization process still needs a bit of study. At least some of them appear to have sperm at the tips of their lophophore, like so. But it's not certain for some other groups. And so, yeah, here are the little baby eggs coming out. There are also some of these, there's a particular freshwater one that can form a thing called a statocyst, which is like a survival capsule for a freshwater lake that is going to either get too cold to support life or potentially even dry out. These are drought resistant and they don't really require any food. They're a way that the bryozoan animal can hibernate and can bounce back in the next year. Hey, there goes the little egg. That looks good. Okay, and so these little legs are going to come out, and that's great. Let's zoom along a little bit because they're doing fine. Here we go. And it's loose. Great. Okay, they're going to have a very short-lived free swimming stage. You can see the little cilia all on the outside, just like they're going to have on their lophophore later on. But yeah, they're also useful for moving at this point. And they're going to start going through their metamorphosis. Kind of like brachiopods do, they're going to turn into the animal that they will become. Yeah, they've got a little eye spot on there. That's the ocellus. And a little apical disc on there, which they are then going to use, I believe, to cement themselves down to something. So these will generally be attached to a hard substrate. And they'll undergo a metamorphosis, and here we go. So this is the first zooid here, the little individual that has settled down and morphed. And what's going to happen is that first one is going to bud, and the bud right next to it is then going to be a second one. So they have asexual reproduction, and that's how they're going to grow the colony. So all the colony are essentially clones of each other. But then they can also do sexual reproduction and sort of spread out. And in this way, they can colonize other surfaces. So that's going to be great. All right. And let's jump past that. There we go. Okay, so here's the natural history of bryozoans. Now they're interesting because bryozoans are the only one of the major animal groups that exist now that does not have a record, a fossil record in the Cambrian. Most everything else is present at least from the Cambrian explosion, sometime between 540 and 520 million years ago. But not these guys. They get started in the Ordovician. The earliest fossils are from the earliest Ordovician now, but so far no definite fossils in the Cambrian. There have been several false alarms over the years. One turned out to be a kind of algae that had a very bryozoan looking structure to it, but it was shown not to be. Anyway, in the bryozoa, there are two main groups. So the stenolemmata are going to be sort of hard, skeletonizing, calcium carbonate fueled bryozoa. Gymnolemmata tend to be soft tissue. So these things are all over the place now. They're actually the most common ones, and they are either going to be under mineralized or not mineralized. The early ones, though, the earliest branches, would bore into the shells of other things like brachiopods and just sort of use somebody else's skeleton as their skeleton. Because why not? Yeah, it's a whole lot easier, right? You figure out how to carve yourself a good home, and now you don't need to build one. Yeah, it's like moving underground essentially. You can see that of these groups, most of them either suffered very strongly or even went extinct at the Permian Triassic boundary, which is the Great Dying, which is where a whole lot of stuff went extinct. But yeah, wiped out several lines of these. And there are a few that just barely made it over, at least partway into the Triassic, before they then die out. All right, so what's a bryozoan? Well, there's a bryozoan, but here is how it is similar to a brachiopod. So you've got the animal, like a brachiopod animal, sort of a short worm with a elaborate feeding device. It looks like two little hands, bilaterally symmetric. That's going to be our lophophore. And then, whereas a brachiopod will have a ventral valve, pedicle valve, like that big valve that sits on the bottom. It's like a little cup that the animal's going to sit in. And then the dorsal valve is like a little lid it can raise up when it wants to feed. Bryozoa have a similar thing. So they're going to have a little operculum, which is like a little tiny dorsal valve. And they're going to be able to lift that up when they're ready to feed. And then when they do that, they will inflate the lophophore and they will stick it out and start to feed. And then whenever there's any sign of trouble, they have a great big retractor muscle that's going to yank the entire lophophore back inside. And they have a little operculum closing muscle that's going to snap that lid shut. And so that's how they work. They have pore plates, some of the colonial ones on the sides, and that's a way to share nutrients. So each little chamber contains one animal, one zooid, but there is limited coordination between the zooids, so they will feed each other to some extent, kind of like in a sponge, you know, how they're mostly single-celled, but yeah, they're a little bit multicellular, or a little bit, you know, colonial. If we were to take a fossil bryozoan, these are the ways you would want to slice it, and these are the major structures that you would see. So one of the things you do is you're going to polish off a little bit of the outside of that, because that's going to show you the structure of the individual chambers. Now, they're usually round, but in some cases they'll be sort of like mushroom shaped, depending on what sort of zooid it was, because there are many specialized types. And you can see these little holes in between. These are the spaces in between some of the zooids, and those will look different depending on which kind of animal you are talking about. There are walls between the zooids. So that's these sort of darkened gray little walls up here. And the individual isn't going to get much bigger. It arrives at its size fairly early on. But as the colony gets bigger, they need to keep expanding, and so they're going to move out, which is going to thicken the colony. And so they're going to basically close off the area behind them with a little wall, and they'll just keep moving out. It's kind of like the way tabulate and Brugos corals will put a little wall in there and move up to the next level, only they're moving both up and out just toward the edge always. Yeah. Here is one of the specialized zooids that you would find on certain types of bryozoa. This one's called an avicularia, avicularium singular, avicularia plural, and they look like little parrot heads. Each of these is a specialized zooid, so they're the same animal, but they have specialized in such a way that they're going to use that operculum. Their operculum develops a little spine in it, and they're going to grow a little spine at the edge of the large valve that they basically live in. And then they're going to use their retractor muscles and their operculum closing muscle to snap that. And they use some of the other muscles that would retract the lophophore to move around. And so you got a little snapping jaw that looks like a little bird head on a stick that is going to wave around, and it's thought that these provide a defense for the colony. There are other specialized bryozoan zooids. Some of them will have a great big long thing. It's called a vibraculum, and they can wave these around to sort of whisk debris off the colony. It's thought that they may be able to move to a limited extent using these vibracula. So yeah, it's a complex colonial little animal consisting of lophophorate individuals that are called zooids. Here you can see some fossilized and fairly recent ones. I think these are mostly fossilized. And so here you can see here some that fossilized with the operculum in place. And so the operculum is this little door. It's the same name they give for the little piece that a snail uses to close its shell. That's usually, I think, going to be more chitinous. Like what you have here. In between the regular feeding zooids, they're called autozooids, you're going to have avicularia. And so here you can see they have a specialized sort of more pointy hole that they leave behind. But these look like the holes where the avicularia are in modern bryozoa. These will also have some specialized zooids called kinozooids. These are specialized, and they're going to build a very thick wall around themselves, and they're going to be mostly structural. So some of these others, like avicularia, are very weak feeders. They have a much reduced lophophore, so they're going to be more dependent on feeding through the pore plates from other members of the colony. And the same is true of the other specialized zooids. They'll be partly or completely dependent on feeding from the rest of the colony. So everybody's got a job to play. Yeah. All right. Here's another example of a fossil, and you can see the little autozooids here. And look at these things. They are absolutely surrounded by these little tiny pointy pits, which are interpreted as the spots where avicularia would have been. You can see sort of swollen areas next to these that are sort of bulging up. These are interpreted as ovicells, which are the cells that produce the little eggs that we saw earlier that go out and get fertilized and can then start new colonies. And then, of course, there's going to be budding just at the edge of the colony. The individuals that are there are going to asexually reproduce and spread the colony out. So bryozoa can have two major appearances. The one, they can be sort of self-contained. They'll grow up and it'll look like a little, kind of like a coral, but with very, very small holes on it compared to corals. The other appearance is that they can take on a sort of an encrusting appearance, where they're going to grow on something else, often something that's hard. Very often things like brachiopods or corals, just whatever is there, it will be colonized by these little bryozoa. They were very good at covering surfaces. We know that modern bryozoa are, at least the ones that have been studied the most, are highly toxic. There was a while where they thought they might get a really good anti-cancer drug, bryostatin, out of them, but it turned out to not work very well, like higher toxicity than desired. But highly poisonous, although there are some gastropods, it's always gastropods, that will feed on them, that'll just go along and scrape them out of their little houses and murder them across the colony. Okay, here is some organic preservation in brachiopods. And the cool thing is it looks brown. Yeah, so you can kind of see the organics in there. Look at those little brown blobs. Now, it's hard to say what exactly we are looking at here. Are these individual cells? Are these, parts of cells? Are these things that used to be structures? Are these decay products from broken down parts of the organic components? Yeah, very difficult to say, but a lot of the soft parts will sometimes get preserved in areas of exceptional fossilization. Now, when zooids land, what you'll get will be a founder zooid. It's often going to look a little larger than the others, and that's going to be dead center of the colony if you're dealing with an encrusting type bryozoan. And those will then sort of bud, and all around them you will get sort of the asexually derived offspring of the bryozoa. So when you get a bryozoan, when you're looking at an encrusting bryozoan, see if you can find the middle of it, see if you can spot the founder zooid, often a little bigger than some of the others. Because at least early on, it's got a lot of work to do in terms of growing new babies to form a colony around itself. Here are some Ordovician bryozoa. We got 2 slides worth of these just so you can see some images of them. The thing they're going to have in common is that whether they are growing on something or whether they are growing just kind of on each other or encrusting like these, there are going to be a lot of little tiny holes, and each of the holes was a zooid at the time. Even this one up here, it's a little chain, but it's a chain of individuals that have little holes at various points. Like here's a little hole I'm circling. You can see it better over here. Look at these things. They're just perfect little ovals with a little hole on there. So it's like a little animal that lives in a shoebox, and it has a little lid it can open, and then it comes out and feeds, and then it pulls itself back in at the first sign of danger. Yeah, so these are some of the Ordovician ones. Here are some other Ordovician bryozoa. It's mostly going to be the Stenolemmata that leave a really good early fossil record because they're the ones that are heavily mineralized. And so you have to wait for other things to mineralize, and then some of the Gymnolemmata will bore into them. Um, uh, so I don't know. You can think of Gymnolemmata as like they need to go to the gym, they got to work out because they need to like dig their way through somebody else, whereas Stenolemmata are just like strong. Yeah. So they'll form great big colonies like this that will superficially resemble something like a coral or something like a Chytites sponge. That's the big coralline sponge that was very common during the Carboniferous. Some of them will resemble, on the outside anyway, a rugose coral. Look at that, a little horn coral. And the way you can tell the difference of these is if you do these sections. You got to section it like we did up there. And if you do, you'll see that it's actually made up of a bunch of individual little chambers inside. And each little chamber is its own zooid. So whereas if we zip back here, there we go. Whereas a coral would have one main animal living in the center of it that would then move up each year. So you would expect this to be more or less open, at least in the center. The bryozoa are going to be made of 3-dimensionally stacked little individuals. Each one is sort of long and sausage shaped. And each one is going to house one zooid. And they're all going to be little clones of each other for the most part. You get cases where some of these will start to encrust over each other. They must have had little bryozoan wars for who gets the prime realty, where you're in a good position to do filter feeding. And that is very much what they did, filter feeding all the time. Here is a cutaway of some of these. This is just showing the typical appearance. And so you have a bunch of zooids in the center. And then as these get toward the outside, they're going to build up these strong walls to separate themselves. In between some of the walls, it's too narrow for a zooid. And so they're just going to build little sort of cross bridges in between there. And then within each of the zooids, you can see they've got these little layers that they're putting in so that the actual bryozoan animal is always going to be up on the outside. It can't really get longer in life. Its body kind of wouldn't work if it did that. And so they just keep moving up and moving out. That's the way they do it. So there you go, bryozoa. They're pretty neat, and they are very common fossils in the Paleozoic. Just all over the place. You'll find way more bryozoa than corals. You may overlook them. Some of them look like fans. Some of them look like screen doors. Some of them look like little sticks, but when you zoom into the little sticks, you'll find that there are paired little holes running up the side that were, yeah, just the little zooids. So how do they reproduce? So we've got the asexual type reproduction and the sexual reproduction through the ovicells. Go ahead and look back on that if you want another look at it. Pull some details out of there. How do they relate to other animal groups? Well, they are lophophorates, and their lophophore works just like a brachiopod lophophore. Some of the muscles are analogous, and the lifestyle is actually fairly analogous. The big difference being that they are colonial. So it's not that they're a colonial brachiopod. I don't want you to take that away. It's just that that's the most similar way. That's like a good concept you can use to frame what they are. Just an obligate colonial lophophorate little animal that's a filter feeder. Yeah. Okay, name some of the specialized zooid types. So do you remember the vibraculum? That's the little vibrating whisk to keep things off. Do you remember the avicularium? Yeah, the little parrot head that sort of snaps shut, or rather the bottom snaps onto it. Yeah, that's fine. Do you remember the ovicell, the one that produces the little eggs? Do you remember the statoblast, the one that's going to be the sort of drought-resistant survival chamber? Do you remember the autozooid, the feeding zooid, the one that does all the work? Yeah, those are some of them. Look back in there. Get a picture of them. Get it in your mind so that when you see one of these things on the spots test, you can say, oh, okay, I know what that is. I understand what's going on here. That's the goal of this class and I guess everything in life, right? Yeah. To look at it and say, yeah, all right, I know this. And actually mean it. Have it be true. So in terms of the growth, remember that the animal is going to stay similar. It's going to grow at the edges of the colony by budding. The hard parts on each individual zooid, if it's in the stenolemmata, are going to be secreted by that zooid. And they'll also modify the neighboring area around themselves. And they're going to put in little layers, kind of like the tabuli that are in corals. But you can see when you slice open a bryozoan, it does not look like a coral. It looks like a bunch of little individuals all stacked up and living together. And then you got your two main groups. You got your stenolemmata and your gymnolemmata. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And I would say if you want to learn more about these, there's actually a very good web reference on these, which is the Digital Atlas of Ancient Life, Bryozoa chapter. It's super. I pulled like half the stuff from here and some of the other stuff from a really good review. But if you're just getting into these, I would say that's the reference for you. It's got all the embedded videos. It's got a ton more than we're going to cover here. Bryozoa. Deep dive on Bryozoa. Why not? Because if you go out fossil hunting, you will find a lot of them, and it's good to be able to recognize them because a lot of other people won't. These are a neglected phylum of animals, but they're all over the place. So give them their due. All right. Thanks very much. This has been Bryozoa.